So this is Diane Arias with the Community Technical Assistance Center at NYU's McSilver Institute, and I would like to welcome you to part two of our two-part clinical intensive, Youth and Technology Mental Health Redefined, with Dr. Lisa Stroman and Dana Chandler. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to orient everyone so you know how to participate in today's event. Upon joining the webinar, you have been placed on mute to avoid any background noises that may distract others from listening to the presentation. If you come across any technical issues during today's event, please chat to the CTEC host who will be able to assist you. If you would like to activate the closed captions, you can also do so by clicking on the toolbar button that says Live Transcript, and then you can select Show Subtitles. We will have a Q&A portion toward the end, but please submit your questions using the chat box at any point during the webinar today. At the end of today's presentation, we will also have a short free feedback survey, and we would appreciate you completing it. Your feedback and suggestions help to inform our future offerings. And lastly, the recording and slides and any additional resources for today's presentation will be posted on our CTEC website, ctechny.org, within the next 2 to 3 days. On the slide you are seeing here in regards to continuing education credits, we are offering 3 continuing education credits free of charge for those that attend this two-part offering. So to be eligible, you must be a licensed social worker or a licensed mental health counselor who attended both presentations. You must also use your unique Zoom-generated link, so there's no sharing of links, and use a computer, as attending via cell phone is not acceptable for CEs. On the next CE slide, if you are eligible, you will be receiving instructions on how to obtain the CEs via email the next 2 to 3 business days. However, if you have any CE-related questions, you can reach out to NYU Silver School via phone or email at silver.continuingeducation@nyu.edu. But again, as a reminder, there are no partial CEs being offered. So once again, I want to thank you for joining us. I will now pass it along to Dana Chandler and Dr. Lisa Stroman to introduce themselves and to get us started. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm excited to have you here and to have my colleague Dana jumping in and helping with the solutions. As you were here last time, I'm a clinical psychologist and attorney, and I've worked in the space for about 20 years, and I specialize in kind of the issues that are related to the psychology of technology and how it's impacting our kids.
And good morning, everybody. My name is Dana Chandler, and I am in the education scope. I've been a principal and a special education teacher, and I do consulting in helping teams put together plans for kids that work. So hopefully today you'll get some solutions that you'll enjoy and can use in your practice.
So I'm going to jump in. I'm going to do some of the slides as is Dana, but I'm going to start us off. What we're going to be covering today is really looking at what are those protective and risk factors as mental health providers that we can look to. We're going to follow up with the home-based reading assignment that you were sent, and that just deciding which chapter that you read or didn't read. We're going to go through each one of those. Then we're going to look at the balance of healthy tech and what that looks like. And then what is it that kids truly need from providers? And then at the end, tons of resources. So lots of links and lots of information for you all to take with you and be good stewards in the space. I'm going to start just really quickly on kind of a clinical example with use for technology overuse, because I think it's important to understand that a lot of times as clinicians or mental health providers, we don't really attach the devices to some of the mental health issues that are going on, because the devices are really kind of a portal to bring those in. So an example of a case that I worked on was a young man presented to me at 17. When he was 15, he had been given a picture of his girlfriend unclothed. Obviously at 15, he thought that was pretty exciting. He sent that image over to a few of his close friends. Those close friends sent it out. And ultimately within 6 months of that time, that the girl had transferred schools on 3 separate occasions. But obviously from a digital standpoint, that just kept catching up to her. And 6 months later had taken her life. So I was presented with a 17-year-old who now had moved multiple states. They'd moved twice and was presenting to me as someone who had massive grief and depression and all of these issues, but truly started with the issue of, spending time on his phone, using it in inappropriate ways and all of those things. So I think that when the family came to me, they were a little bit sensitive about like sharing that information. So I would just say that it's important to have that conversation with your clients and just bring it part of that assessment piece in it. And we're going to give you tools on how to do some assessment tool, download some tools that we've created that I'm happy to share with all of you to use. So let's get into the protective factors. Obviously, working with parents, like, and having clear backgrounds, they're the ones who typically are managing how often those kids can actually use the technology. I truly believe direct to clients, talking to the teenagers themselves and having them engage in using it responsibly themselves, but obviously bringing in whoever the caregivers are in that situation is most important to deal with. The educational and productive use is really looking at tech as a tool, not as a toy, and really differentiating that for our kids. One of the examples that I use is the digital food pyramid. So I say, everybody knows about the food pyramid, kind of play, social media, gaming, that kind of stuff is at the top of that kind of junk food, and we should use it very sparingly. But there is really good technology uses for educational and productive use creation for artists and things like that. Self-regulation skills is a big one. So, we've got a lot of people on here, and so it depends on the age group that you're working with. But obviously that self-regulation is age dependent, and it's, becomes better the older that they get. So it's really jumping in and understanding the client's developmental stage and how we can help them regulate that with other tools. So do we put timers on our phone, or do we do things where we can actually take the device and help them set up those tools if they don't have a family or member or a caregiver that can help them with that? And then active engaged offline activities, really supporting that balance. If you're going to be online for a couple hours a day, are you doing something offline for a couple hours? So that can be very protective, because we're actually giving them that balance that they may not otherwise have. So I check in on that when I'm doing clinical factors of like, how are you spending your days or after school and those kind of things. And then obviously risk factors, unlimited access or lack of supervision. I'm shocked still today at the number of kids that really don't have any like cell phone plan contracts with their families or caregivers, and kind of talking to them a little bit about why those restrictions are important. And even if we can't actually engage on that supervision piece, understanding that and understanding that they're going to have challenges on that space. Obviously, social pressure and fear of missing out. It is no different than it was, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years ago, where trends hit. And with social media and gaming platforms, what kids are doing and what they're on is really important in order for them to feel as part of the cohort. So the part of that is like they don't ever get an off time for them. So it's amplified, obviously, if they're doing it only to be included and they're comparing themselves over and over again. The mental health challenges, I think I showed the graph last time. It's very clear that with overuse, there's definite impacts. It's not always one-to-one. So I would never say that it's a causative factor 100%, but it is a contributing factor, and it's correlated with use. And there's lots of studies on it. And we made these all clickable links so that you can go into some of the studies and then kind of trace back through and find more resources for yourselves as well. And then finally, sleep disruption and cognitive impacts is obviously one of those issues that I would say there's science on both sides. Interestingly, more recently, that talks about how loss of sleep isn't necessarily the issue. But I would say that in my clinical practice, one of the things that I see is that kids are getting disrupted sleep when they keep their phones in their room, and it does impact them. They're not academically as strong. They're not emotionally as strong. So those are some of the things over the 20 years of practice I've done that I've personally noticed, and I think are really important. So I'm going to let Dana take over at this point, and I'll jump back in a little bit.
Good morning. This is a little video called Like and Follow. You can find it on YouTube because of broadband issues this morning. We're not going to play it, but you will get the slide with this in it. And it's really just a cute little way to show how kind of cell phones are taking over kids' lives. So if you'll pop to the next slide, we're going to go through some of those things as we talk through the readings that you did, hopefully last time. We asked for people to read either chapter 10, 11, 12, or 13 of the book Digital Distress, which you could all download. So right now there's a poll that should be popping up on your screen. If you'll take just a few minutes and answer the questions.
Yes, so we invite everyone on this webinar to answer that first question, yes or no. Again, just to really get a sense of whether or not you were able to complete it. If you weren't, certainly no worries. But then, the follow-up questions 2 and 3, really depending on whether or not you were able to answer. So it would be great if you could just take the time to just answer these 3 questions or the 2 questions. They'll be up for just a few more seconds. And I'm seeing on the chat, is it possible to get the slides recordings if you didn't attend part 1? Yes, absolutely. My colleague, Leslie, who's under the CTech admin, can certainly give you the link, but it's also further up on the chat there. But you can certainly access the recordings and the slides for part 1. And I certainly encourage to any of you who are in part 2 and didn't get a chance to do that, please certainly do so. So yeah, we have the poll up. It'll be up for a little bit longer, just a few more seconds. So again, please take the time to fill it out. Thank you.
Okay.
So thank you so much for everyone that participated. We do see that a good majority of you unfortunately did not have the time or were not able to do the readings, which is perfectly fine. In terms of which ones were selected, and I think that's also interesting just to highlight. Sorry to jump in, Dana, but it seems that the one that was read the most for folks was the video games chapter 1, followed by social media and bullying, followed by pornography, and then children with unique needs. Thank you so much for participating.
Thank you guys for reading the chapter. For those of you who did the video games, that does seem to be one of the most pressing problems at the time. And so, Dr. Stroman, if you could just pop the next slide. We'll talk about chapter 10 and the impacts of video games, because this one seems to be a really prevalent problem in the schools where I work. And because kids are watching video games and they love video games, there's a lot of educational things that we can do about that. We have a lot of educational video games, but I think the ones that really have the impact are the ones that are violent, they're aggressive, they're not necessarily positive role models for children to watch. Kids will play them late into the night, so they lose sleep. And we can see the correlation with depression and anxiety over that. If you'll pop to the next slide, Miss Lisa. But the one thing we did last time was we talked a lot about the problems, but we also want to make sure you have solutions before you leave today. That was one of the questions from last time. But remember, in the chapters, if you haven't had a chance to read them yet, I really encourage that, because at the end of every chapter, there's a page of takeaways. What can I get from this, and how will it help me when I'm dealing with kids? And so establishing those clear boundaries for screen time is really important. Setting timers, having the kids help you with those boundaries are pretty good too. Then figuring out what those underlying emotional triggers are for stress and anxiety. They sometimes they can mask some of those things, so we want to make sure that we're paying attention. The other thing too is that kids, a lot of them just assume if we're going to have game time, it's on a screen. And a lot of them don't have a lot of exposure to just board games or other kind of games that you can play. So really some screen-free game activities is a great idea. And then building those social connections. In some of the research and stuff that I did, that human connection piece was the highest need that we found in kids that we were working with. So that chapter 10 is video games. It's a pretty important one. If you read chapter 11 on pornography, could you please put that in the chat box right now? What were your takeaways from that chapter? I'm going to give you just a couple seconds. There were some of you that read chapter 11. Let's put your takeaways in the chat box if you can, please. And while you're doing that, we'll start on the chapter about pornography. When we talk about pornography, it leaves a pretty negative connotation for most of us. And it's a little scary to think that kids are getting exposure to this. It is $1 billion industry, which in the book and last time when we met, I think we mentioned that 35%, that's 1 in 3, basically, all downloads online are porn or porn materials. Kids are typically exposed at the age of 8 now. And teens, it's their most searched term. But there are some things we can do about it. In the chapter, again, I want to encourage you at the end of every chapter, there's some takeaways. But I think that because of the exposure to porn, we can't just deny that kids are being exposed. So we need to really have those conversations with kids and that open dialogue about sexuality and what it means and how does that make you feel? Because if we say, oh, kids just shouldn't be exposed to that, and then we say nothing, then it's kind of open field day, and you don't really know where that's going to go with kids if they don't have guidance. Again, those triggers and coping mechanism. How do you cope with this? Dr. Lisa talked about the scenario earlier about the photo that got passed around, and it impacts a lot of people, not just somebody who's been exposed physically, but those around that get exposed to that as well. And then educating kids on the impact of pornography, but not just kids, adults. Sometimes I hear parents say, oh, it's not a big deal. It's just a rated R movie, but they watch them all the time. And they don't understand that the impacts of that kind of normalizes inappropriate behavior. And then kids, they have a tough time figuring out what is appropriate and what isn't. So some of those conversations and being open with kids about that, I think, is necessary. So we're just kind of summarizing the chapters. If you want to know more information, please go back to your text. But we're looking at chapter 12 now. If you read the chapter on social media and cyberbullying, this is a big one too. Please type in what your takeaways were in the chat box. And while you're typing, we're going to be summarizing everything in the chat too, which is really awesome. So if you miss some things, you'll be able to pick up on that. And for chapter 12 for social media, just a summary of the chapter is that, there's 3 billion users on social media every day. That's a huge amount of people. 43%, in the research for the book, 43% of kids had reported that they've been bullied online, but that actually statistic has gone up now, and it's actually 55%, but only 10% of those kids are going to tell a trusted adult. And so what that means is that kids are going to witness bullying, they're going to be bullied, and they're not going to say anything. And so then they lack the guidance of how to deal with it. So in chapter 12, there's some ideas that we have for you. And the first is really create a safe space for open communication. Kids are not going to adults because, one, they may be intimidated or afraid of adults, but most likely it's that they're not sure how they're supposed to respond. Was it a joke? Was it not a joke? Are their feelings valid? And so building that conversation of trustworthiness with kids so that they feel like they can go to an adult and tell them is really important. And then again, giving them the coping skills of emotional regulation when you're talking about things that can get upset. How should I handle this in a way that's appropriate? That's a sense of response that's justified. Some kids might, that regulation is tough, so they resort to physical where they're going to hit somebody or throw something. Some go inwardly where they get depressed and they have a lot of anxiety. And so teaching kids, how do we manage those kinds of feelings? And then I love this one. It's teaching digital literacy. Where are the healthy boundaries for technology? The one thing Dr. Lisa and I kind of preach over and over again, besides the dangers of technology, there's a balance. Technology can be used for a lot of good. So we don't want you to come away from this thinking that all technology is bad and that you shouldn't use it, because that is not what we're saying at all. And so teaching kids those healthy boundaries, how they can use technology to leverage what they know and what they do, rather than let it be a detriment and hold them back from being better human beings. So that's kind of where we're going. Chapter 13, now we're going to go into children with unique needs. And this one's a little different than the other three because it specifically talks about just those sensory and ADHD impacted kids. But if you read chapter 13, could you please put your takeaways in the chat box? We'll give you just a couple of minutes to get that in the box. And then to summarize this chapter, we're talking about kids with unique needs. These are kids where transitions are pretty difficult. They're easily distracted. They have a lot of emotional dysregulation. They have social difficulties. Sometimes they're in your face. Sometimes those spatial boundaries sometimes can be problems. And they have communication deficits typically. Now, of course, we're speaking generally. We're not talking about every kid that has sensory issues, because we know that every child is different. But kids that really have those issues really are at greater risk. So some of the things, and those are, in my practice, those are really most of the kids that I am helping, the kids with those unique needs. But we can create a plan that will work for them, including starting with those routines and structures that's predictable for them. When it's not predictable, they will fill their time, and it won't be with good balanced stuff if they don't have guidance for where that goes. Also, using positive reinforcement. And then when I work with people, we build in a lot of sensory breaks, or just breaks from everything, where I can just take a breath and breathe or do something calming. And then also that social skills training. We use a lot of social stories to teach with our communication, but because expressive language sometimes can be really tough, especially for those who are dysregulated emotionally, teaching them the words, and sometimes even giving them the words, modeling it, and then letting them practice it enough that they can say it spontaneously. Those are incredibly helpful skills for kids that's struggling with too much screen time. So let me give you a little background and research. Dr. Lisa wrote the book, Digital Distress, Growing Up Online, which you all got, and hopefully you read a chapter or two. But after I read the book, Dr. Lisa and I have been friends for many decades. And after I read the book a few years ago, it was life-changing for me and altering, because as a person who works in the schools every day, I was seeing everything that was in this book. And I worked with families who were seeing this at home. And so what we did was we went into schools and we actually did groups of kids and worked with teachers, and we came up with some practical strategies to use for both educators and mental health providers, so that when you're helping families work through the process of kids with too much online time, we call it overuse, there's some real specific strategies in what you can do to help make it better. And so hopefully after today is over, you're going to have a whole basket full of tools that you can take back to your practice and use as we go along. So Lisa, if you'd pop to the slides, we're going to be talking about the fact that technology is neither good nor bad, nor is it neutral. Not all technology is created equal. You've probably figured that out already. That's what I usually tell people. Not all technology is created equal. Some technology is amazingly positive and beneficial for us, but some of it can drag us down holes we don't want to go. So where is that balance in digital distress? If you've read through much of it, Dr. Lisa talks about what she calls the Goldilocks zone. And that means not too much technology, but not too little technology. Let's face it, we live in a world that's full of technology. If you don't know how to run a computer, you're not even going to be able to fill out a job application now. So you've got to have a balance of what's not too hot, too much, or what's not too cold. I have no skills to run a computer. So we have to figure out it's just right. And for some people that's different than others, but finding that balance for kids helps them be happy and healthy. And that's what we're going for. So what can you do as providers? Hopefully we're going to talk to you about that right now. Go ahead, Dr. Lisa.
So I'll jump in here a little bit. One of the greatest, I think, gifts to a child is to empower them to have voice in the space and to help them become aware of what kind of the parameters of technology is, how it might be impacting their life, having those conversations with them, just assuming that it is partly an issue in their lives. So one of the things that we did, and just to show you how robust it was, this is when we first did our pilot. We put 8,000 students through our program, and so you can see in 2011 is when we first did our very first test. Actually, sorry, 2015 is when we did our very first test. 2011, 2012 is when the data started for the school system. And so they had over 600 incidents in a campus of over 900 students that were total discipline issues, but they had 40% of them were technology related. And then in 2012, that same school about equal in the total discipline incidents, but 50% became technology related. And then in 2013, 2014, for any of you that I love data. So 2013, 2014, they actually brought in a new assistant principal into the school system who was ex-military. And so total discipline went down very greatly across the board. But as you can see, their technology related incidents kept rising to 58%. 2014, it went to 71%. And then in 2015, 72%. So DCA was being developed at that time. And I got called in, and we actually were responding to a sexting incident that happened in this campus. So what happened was one child shared an image to a few friends, very similar to the clinical story that I had. But within that end of day, out of those 900 students, over 700 students had that image in their phones that had been dispersed. What happened in that case was the SRO, or student resource safety resource officer on campus, started to bring the students in, and those that had these images on their phone, he read them their juvenile Miranda rights, and started to write them up, cite them. So I got called in, and I was like, like, on what planet is this okay? These kids have you've never told them that, what's wrong with this. And they had never had training that even requesting an image, like if a child asks and says, send me a sexy pic, that is solicitation of child pornography under some circumstances, and it depends on the DA and the system of whether or not they're gonna prosecute under that. If they receive it, now they have possession of child pornography, and if they distribute it, that's distribution of child pornography. So as you can imagine, you can have 3 to 4 counts, sometimes hundreds of counts, depending on how many different people that you send that image to, which will escalate that very quickly into a felony. So all we did was come in, we did a training program, we showed them, and in the very following year, when they looked at the total discipline issues, and we gave children the ability to be leaders in the space. And so we created a technology leadership council that came in, and the older students were training the younger students. We dropped it literally almost in half. So I really truly can't impress upon you how important it is to create that relationship with our kids that we're working with, to be able to give them voice in the space, because they do know how to solve these if we give them the respect and the understanding that they do have power here. One of the things that I think is important to address as well is the trauma-informed principles, because what I see is, in clinicians typically see, we can see primary trauma, secondary trauma, and what I call now is tertiary trauma. So primary trauma is the trauma happens to us. Secondary trauma is we witnessed that trauma in person. And so what we're seeing on the online space is sometimes it's tertiary trauma. So there's a massive amount of trauma that's occurring in more than one modality, but it definitely is becoming, the exposure rate is going up and up. And so I think that it's like looking at and talking through, how do we manage that trauma in respectful ways? How do we give them those tools? This is just like a very simple graph of like, the trauma harm principle, like do no harm and make sure that you're addressing their safety issues first. We want to make sure that they feel confident with us, that they can share this information with us. A lot of times I will tell you that kids are not telling us about the trauma that they're being exposed to online, particularly when it relates to inappropriate images or pornography. It's just awkward for them. And so in my clinical practice, in order to create that trustworthiness, I talk often about, the work that I do with internet crimes against children and the fact that there's a multitude of cases that happen out there. And it really is so ubiquitous and so many kids are being exposed. And if they have friends and I give them that space to let them be transparent and start to trust me with that information. I talk through about getting peer support, like sharing that information with them, and how with collaboration, you'll find that a lot of us are working together through these same issues, and that empowers them to speak out a little bit more and have choice. And then obviously, when we're talking about trauma-informed principles and reducing or trying to remove the risk of re-traumatization, like we have to take into consideration that cultural, historical, gender issues, because this generation of kids are dealing with so many different things that we've never had to deal with. And they're in these little silos in social media that allow them to be very transparent and open in many ways. But those issues that make them unique and those things that they're trying to figure out on their own can sometimes come back and bite them. So it's just really looking at that and really trying to identify, how do we create resilience, knowing that we've got a lot of kiddos that are being traumatized. And then finally, back to that awareness slide, the best way to create awareness is to ask them to fill out a tool. So we created a screening tool. We call it the technology use continuum. So I put into that resource guide a link. So those of you that went in and downloaded the book, there's going to be a QR code in the end, and it'll take you through all of the different areas. So physical, behavioral, emotional, interpersonal. It has one for child, one for teen, also one for adult. There's a fourth one that I can't remember what that one addresses. It could be families, but anyway, we have tons of tools. So I'm just gifting that to all of you so that you can have that in your practice. Print them, use them however you can. At some point, DCA will have them as a digitized version, and we'll try to get out those things, but we're constantly trying to help create tools for those that are trying to address this area. And then I think, Dana, you wanted to talk
Yeah.
a little bit.
When we went into the schools, we were working with how do we get kids to be really aware. And the screening tools were great, and we also used what we call the technology log. And we had teams of teachers actually have every kid in the school fill these out. But then parents got a hold of them, and then parents wanted to fill them out. And actually, we were really going under the understanding that in order to help kids regulate their own internet use, it had to be a wraparound service. So if we did it at school but didn't involve the parents, it wouldn't be as effective. So we tried to do it all as a team with some parent nights and things like that. And so one of the things we did was the technology use program. And when we started, we had the teachers fill them out first, just all the educators, whether you're a para, a teacher, a counselor, everybody who worked for the school. And it was amazing, even with the adults, for them to understand how much technology they were using, but then it gave them a conversation piece to have their kids fill it out. So the students filled it out. It was really enlightening to see the kids could see for themselves, how much time did I spend on a device? What did I use the device for? Was I always on just a game, or did I do some Google searches? Was I doing research? Was I on IXL or Prodigy? Some of those educational games that can really promote self-growth. And not all programs online are created equal. So when you look at the log, it was really helpful for kids to see, did I really spend 8 hours last night just, playing Fortnite? And, or some of the other kids where they were on something a little bit more productive. And then helping kids set their own goals, because once they did their log, then each student got to set their own goals, even with the little guys. We had adults helping them, but helping them be aware and decide how much time was probably a good amount of time, of course, with adult guidance, and then encouraging them to stick to their goals. And we had parents look at what kids created as well, so parents then could follow up with that. Excuse me. Let me give you just a little scenario. This little guy, we'll call him Jordan. He was a high functioning autistic kid that I worked with. Um, I was not his special ed teacher nor his principal. I went in to consult with the team to figure out how to make a plan, because at home and at school, he would do nothing but video games. And at school, of course, when he wasn't being offered video games, which was regularly, he at first began yelling, and then he would threaten, pretend he was going to stab people, but then he got violent, where he's hitting people, kicking people, throwing things, knocking over tables, to the point where, he really couldn't be in a room with other kids anymore. Mom was reporting the same thing happening at home. Single mom, she didn't know what to do, so we put together a plan for the whole team, not just at school but at home too. And again, you have to have parent buy-in here, but when parents are struggling, they want help, they want some answers and some assistance. And so we built a plan for Jeremy using a lot of the strategies that we'll be sharing today. I think first we intentionally taught some skills that were deficit, that he really needed, how to teach human connection, how to teach empathy, how to teach kindness, some of those things that didn't come very natural to him. And then also doing a color card system for emotions. I'll show you the zones regulations later, but using some color cards so that when he really verbally couldn't tell you how he was feeling, he could at least show a visual representation of that, which then could lead into more questions and guidance and figuring out better communication. We also, because he was a very negative when he couldn't have it, we started what we called a gratitude generator. And we're going to share that with you today too, where we would give him writing prompts so that he would have to write about something he was grateful for. And again, we started it with prompts so that sometimes it was, I'm grateful for food because. That's when we started very simple. I'm grateful for my food because, and he'd have to fill it out. But as it got more in depth and more in understanding, he was a 12-year-old boy. He had academically, he was very competent, but he just couldn't process those emotions to generalize them, to really be grateful for anything, because it was everybody's fault, because he was miserable because he wasn't playing video games. So when we built in this plan, and then every day we'd go to him and say, here are the expectations. Let's go through what the expectations are. And he had to actually mark off if he met the expectation or not. And if he met the expectation, then we built in some screen time. And this because he loved the screen time. But with the screen time, there were a lot of parameters. And he knew what these boundaries were. But the boundaries were that it was time limited, that we got to choose the content, meaning the school employees or his parent, they got to choose the content, and that it would be physically taken away from him at the end of the time limit if he couldn't willingly give it to us. And while that was pretty rough at first, it did work. If he didn't meet his expectations, he still got choice time. He still got to do what he wanted, but it was different choices. It was not screen time, but it was things that would meet his sensory needs and some physical activities. He did love physical activities. So that was a really great way for him to still get enjoyable time, but not necessarily on a screen. At first, there were huge outbursts. So as you know, when you deal with kids, it doesn't solve the problem immediately, right? There's going to be big outbursts, but eventually those outbursts decreased. Then he was able to talk through what he was feeling, and eventually able to even self-regulate his own time, because we put it on a schedule every day. And then he got to where he'd even choose not to do the screen time, but sometimes do the physical stuff just because that's what he wanted to do. So it took time, it took some planning, but there are some ways that you can really help kids regulate their own screen time if you make them aware of it. Those sensory kids might take a little bit more. But we're going to talk about now the strategies. Now, when I talk about strategies, I'm talking about information, I'm talking about activities or tasks, and then I'm talking about just good advice. So we'll have a whole list of things for you here. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly, but you're going to get access to all of these resources, even if I don't clearly go through every single detail, because I want to make sure that you have these at your fingertips, so that when you have a kid or caregivers that you need to advise to come up with a plan, that you can do that for them. So while we're on this slide, though, a big one for me is setting that phone to grayscale. If you have kids with devices, Putting it on grayscale kind of takes away all that shiny object syndrome. The bells and whistles are kind of gone when you take away all the color. And so that's just a really big one for me. But we'll go through some more here as we go through the list. These are going to look like kind of a boring little list as we go through, but um, trust me, though, some of them you can really leverage. But when we're talking about screen time, we're talking about the television, we're talking about a mobile phone or tablet, we're talking about a computer or a laptop, and then also a game console. So all of those things are considered screen time for definition as we walk through these strategies today.
And I would just add one more is VR and AR headsets.
Oh, yes.
That also counts. So
Thanks, Lisa. Okay, so first of all, of course, I've got grayscale on top one because I have found that it's just not near as much fun on a phone or a tablet if it's on grayscale. So in your resources, it actually has how you do that, but you can go to YouTube and look that up too. Another one that was really helpful for us was setting those clear rules. When kids know exactly what the expectation is, they're much more likely to follow it. And even if they don't, you can just take them back to the rules. Go, but wait a minute, what did we say was the rule here? And the more they can participate in the rules, the better, because then you get more buy-in. But in those rules, also being reasonable. So if you get mad at a kid, you can't say no screen time because it's not really realistic. So what is a realistic expectation for gradually decreasing screen time? Or let the kid decide, okay, well, this week since I have 6 hours of screen time in my log, next week I'm going to do 5, and the week after that I'm going to do 4. So those student logs can really help you with that information too. And then holding them accountable. Again, you make a list of rules. If they've participated in it, you can take them back to those rules and go, but wait a minute, what did we say? If this happens, then this happens. And being consistent with those consequences really helps. And then engaging every time to talk face to face. When I went into the schools and we did the research on what skill we really felt like students were deficit, it's that human connection, right? And being online is kind of a vicious circle as far as the lack of human connection face to face, shaking a hand, looking in the eye contact, because right now I'm looking at you in a camera. It's not the same as looking and giving a human being eye contact. So increasing that human connection, not just verbally, but even with your body language, is a skill that we really felt kids needed. So setting time every day to have a face-to-face conversation with someone. And then set a timer with a 1-minute warning so that kids know, hey, screen time's almost up. And this is where we go. Lisa, if you'll pop to the next slide. Then when we talk about even just figuring out, kids want to have fun. And if they think the only thing they can have fun on is a device, then we need to teach them some other ways to have fun. So intentionally teaching kids in a Wi-Fi free zone. In the case of the scenario that I gave you, Jordan's mom set up a Wi-Fi free zone in the house where she put Jordan loved puzzles, but he didn't know it until we took him offline and he got to do it. So she put a whole game section in a Wi-Fi free zone. My niece puts books in hers for her kids because they love to read. So it really just depends on what the kids' interests are. But having a Wi-Fi free alternative to the computer makes kids feel like they're not missing out on anything. Scheduling time without the phones. So not only the Wi-Fi alternative space, but the Wi-Fi free time is important. And again, I'm just giving you a few. There are a whole lot more suggestions in the resources that we're giving you. The last one real quick. Having this is kind of important if you are helping caregivers. A caregiver who says, oh, honey, go ahead and take your iPad to your bedroom and turn it off at 9 o'clock and I'll see you in the morning. And they know a kid has a problem with it. They're not going to turn it off at 9 o'clock. And if you take that device into a bedroom where there's no adult supervision, you end up with kids going to sites they probably shouldn't be on. So I really recommend that when kids are on their devices, they are somewhere where an adult can monitor. I know when I was in classrooms, I would make sure I could see their screens so that I knew when kids were off of topic or task. And then at a home, make sure your kids can be in the living room. They can do it at the kitchen table if they want, Wi-Fi time. So just keep that in mind as you're helping caregivers plan plans for kids. And the big one, not all screen time is created equal. There are lots of great educational games that are really pretty fun and comparable to some of those other violent video games that you might see. Prodigy is a huge favorite amongst kids, if you've never heard of that. And they have a big free section too in the Prodigy. And hopefully most of the stuff we're going to give you today are free things. No screen time after 8 p.m. Just setting those boundaries of 8 to 8 screen free time, 8 p.m. to 8 a.m. And then the media literacy. This is kind of what I'm hung up on right now, because we can't expect kids to do the right thing if they don't know what it is. I mean, they get handed a device and basically you're saying good luck. And then we wonder why they make mistakes on it. Kids are going to make mistakes. So let's teach them how to do it appropriately. And so actually, Dr. Lisa and I are working on a media literacy kind of course for people that we can download on our website for free. But digital media, you can look on YouTube to try to, get some ideas on what to teach kids. But what's fake news? What's real news? What do you handle if a kid asks you for a pic? Or what do you do when somebody's cyberbullying you? Some of those things are really important skills that kids need to know that we didn't know we were supposed to teach them until we figured out there was a problem. And we're all learning this together. I often tell people I work with, we are fixing the plane while we're flying it. And so the important thing is that we just don't let it crash. So anyway, here's how to set your phone to grayscale. You can take a picture of the screen if you'd like. This one, I think, in my opinion, as I've said before, is the most important one. Even for adults, because I've seen a lot of adults who can't put their devices down. So if you have a good role model in an adult, kids are more likely to do it. So this is also in your resources. So what skill or characteristics, I talked a little bit about what skills are deficit for kids who are struggling with online overuse. What skill, when you're talking about kids in the practice that you have today, what skills do you think they're deficit? And this was a question we had to ask ourselves as we were doing some of this research. So in the chat box, if you'd put in, what skill do you think, give me one or two, don't give me a long list, but just give me one or two. What do you think are the most important skills that kids are lacking today that we should work on them with? I'll give you a couple minutes to put in the chat box. I'm seeing some social skills, emotional regulation. Oh, coping skills. Good one. Oh, how to be bored. That's a great one. Communication skills, conflict resolution. Oh, patience. Yes, with the internet, everything comes instant, right? How do we teach them patience? Decision making, listening, using a pencil. That's a good one. And while that may seem kind of funny, it's really not untrue. Kids don't want to write, they want to use a computer. Great. Oh, boundaries is a good one too. Very good. Well, let's talk a little bit about how to intentionally teach skills. When we went into our schools, our teachers, that was their biggest complaint too. And I asked them to make this list as well. And your list is not at all different than theirs. These were all of the skills that teachers felt kids were deficit as well. And what I've got on the screen are just two examples of what we did. But we took sheets basically, and we specifically stated what is the target skill. The big ones were human connection and empathy. How do I understand what another person's feeling? Not sympathy, not how do I feel sorry for them, but how do I truly understand why they're thinking the way they're thinking? And so then we built in what would be a regular routine or something we do in the classroom every day, every week, every month to build in activities to increase those skills. And then we also listed specific activities that we wanted to do to build those skills. I'll give you a human connection. The teacher said, I'm going to do a handshake at the door every morning. I'm greeting them, I'm looking them in the eyes, and I'm telling them what to do. So we specifically made a list of what they were deficit. And when you're working with those kids, that might be a brainstorming activity you had with their caregivers. And then start intentionally teaching those skills because it may not come naturally to them. That fostering the human connection, we really worked about being present, teaching them eye contact, greeting them personally, giving them conversation skills. What's a sentence starter? If I say, good morning, it's nice to see you, how do you respond? How do you communicate in appropriate ways? And then practicing that interaction with other people. So it's not just the human connection with an adult, it's a human connection with other peers as well. And then as they become better at it, then of course those interactions become more appropriate. They become more comfortable with it. So those personal connections create less anxiety, and then they begin to enjoy it and really want to do it more. So it's kind of a good circle in that it creates more skills, which creates more practice, which creates better skills. So anyway, we'll go to the next slide. Some of the things that you can use to enhance some human connections. Dr. Lisa has these in her book, Digital Distress Growing Up Online, is do some of these activities. This is just a few of them, but there's a ton of just non-Wi-Fi activities that promote conversation. And when you promote conversation, then kids get practice doing all of that stuff. As you know, I'm probably preaching to the choir here. Starting a family book club was one of my favorites because you could read a book as a family and then talk about what the book, not just what the book was about, but practice those empathy factors of how do you think this character felt? Or what would you have done if you were in this character's shoes? And then the family art project was wonderful because you can post that and you form those bonds and connections, creating more trusting adults that kids can go to when they really have problems. So this also will be in the slide deck, which you'll get at the end of this presentation. So I know I've talked and talked, but we are going to just start listing resources and resources and resources, and you will get copies of all of these things when we're done. So teaching media literacy. First of all, let me explain what this is. Media literacy is really what kids need to know in order to stay safe online. Leveraging the media and online technology programs, searches, how do we leverage that to benefit our growth? And so that's what I'm talking about in media literacy. And so some ideas for teaching that is helping them to understand what it is and why. Sharing, letting them share online experiences, whether that's negative experiences or positive experience, it doesn't matter, because once they share those experiences, then they have to offer advice to the adult they're sharing it with. Have teens do the fact checking. If you say a fact to a kid, how do they know if it's true? Have those conversations about that. How kids can investigate what media literacies, what media programs or sites they go to, and then make recommendations and why. Because that really gets kids to thinking, is this a really positive website that I'm going to? Or should I delete this? And we need to find something more positive. And then it also, all of this self-awareness helps kids analyze and evaluate and really create and act and use on the media in positive ways. So they get to be the masters of their own domain when it comes to Wi-Fi. Digital Citizen Academy, I got involved with a couple of years ago. Dr. Lisa founded it a number of years ago. I got involved with it a couple of years ago because the whole primary purpose is to educate parents, counselors, schools, and kids about the risks of online safety, but also how do you navigate the online world safely and productively. So it's not just safe, but how do we use it to benefit? And so the Digital Citizen Academy is an awesome nonprofit organization, and I've used some of their resources. Now, some of their resources are free. They do have a paid program, although Dr. Lisa is working on grants to get that paid for everybody, but a paid program of digital media lessons that kids can go through. but that's in the future. But they have a lot of things on their website just for resources and um, places you can go to help teach them things. I'm going to show you a couple, for example, like roll a story. It's a dice game where you give kids different scenarios depending on what numbers they roll. For example, you'll look at if they roll a 1 the first time, then they're talking about a character named Digi, who on DCA, Digital Citizen Academy, Digi is kind of their mascot. So if kids are exposed to Digital Citizen Academy, they'll know who Digi is. And then say they roll a 4, so that means in the second box, it's at home, Digi's at home. And then they roll a 2, so Digi's at home and asks for a password for a website. What do you do? And then the kid has to explain what they do. So it's really a game of conversation, but problem solving. And it teaches that media literacy of what's safe and recommended to do. Or another one where you get to create your own superhero. You know, what's your superhero name? They get to create a whole superhero power and how that would relate to digital citizenship. These are just 2 activities. There are more on the there are tons of these that you can find. If you just went into YouTube and typed in digital literacy lessons, you can find a bunch of examples of these too. And then I love reading books to kids, and I love primary. Primary is so much fun. Dr. Lisa wrote a book called Phone Alone. But this is one of many. I'm not here saying buy everything that we're going to show you, because I believe that there's resources in your library that are going to be free and you can use it to teach digital literacy to kids. This particular example is a graphic novel, so it depends on what kids want to use. But there are stories now that you can use to teach digital literacy, what's safe to do online and what's not safe to do online. If you're interested, this is a book by Dr. Lisa Stroman called Phone Alone. One of my favorite resources is by CBS. It's called Kindness 101. If you've ever heard of On the Road with Steve Hartman is what the old series used to be called. On the Road with Steve Hartman started out with Steve Hartman put his finger on a name in a phone book because he believed everybody had a story to tell. And he would go to this person and tell a story. And as he went through the years with these stories, somebody suggested to him, you know, these stories you really curb around positive things and positive character traits and how to teach kids skills intentionally using real life examples. Why don't you make a teaching series? So CBS gave him a bunch of money and agreed that he could produce and create Kindness 101. He used his own children as news broadcasters, basically. And you can go and look up CBS Kindness 101, and the link is in these slides so you can see it. And you can see little video snippets on any topic that you need to teach kids that you can think possible. Empathy, kindness, honesty, how do you have courage, how do you solve problems? There's so many of them that that I'm sure you can find what you need just to teach it. But it's kind of directed from a kid's point of view. So just keep that in mind. But I really encourage you to go see them. The link, of course, will be in your slide deck when you get it. And then another one is Zones of Regulation. Now, Zones of Regulation, the actual book Zones Regulation is not free. It does cost money. You can find it on Amazon or any place that sells books. But if you go online and you just type in the Zones of Regulation, free stuff, there is so many tools that they have that you can use to help kids learn how to self-regulate their emotions. It's a color-coded system, you know, the red, yellow, blue, and green, green being the we're good to go zone. And then the other colors represent different social emotional feelings that kids can help identify, especially if they're communication deficit. But this really teaches kids how to talk about their emotions instead of show the physical signs of dysregulation because they don't know how to get it out. So Zones of Regulation is a big plus for me as well. And then some examples too, teaching kids mindfulness, helping kids identify their own triggers. Practicing gratitude. I was amazed with Jordan when you practice gratitude. Once he figured out that life wasn't all bad because he couldn't have a video game, his whole demeanor changed. And it really helped him with that excess anxiety that he was feeling because he couldn't play that video game. His wasn't just, I got to have the video game because I want it. His was really a sensory issue. And because of his lack of communication skills, he couldn't really communicate that to us. And so we ended up seeing it in emotional dysregulation. And that gratitude generator that we did really helped him understand that. But also just the basics that you guys all know, the deep breathing, let's get some exercises, giving some choices, acknowledging my emotions. And then I think most important is teaching kids how to laugh, because I'm not sure some kids understand that laughter is really good for you. So sometimes with Jordan, we just pull out a few dad jokes and teach them to him. And then he thought it was hysterical when he got to tell them to other people, which also increased his human connection and his ability to communicate. So anyway, just something to think about. And I know you probably know most of these, but again, there's a lot more resources in there in your resource guide when you get them. And then that cognitive behavior therapy, trying to really analyze a child's behavior so that you can set up a plan to help them curb that behavior. And you're not going to be there every day probably for a kid, but how do you teach the caregivers to do some of these things? Become aware. How do you teach the caregiver to teach a kid how to become aware of their thoughts? Or how does a caregiver evaluate behavior in order enough to tell you, the consultant, what to do? These are kind of some techniques. You'll have some examples of these in your resources as well, that you can teach caregivers how to pull from their kids. So pull might be the wrong word there, but how to draw it out. So if you'll go to the next slide. The gratitude generator. This is the slide about the gratitude generator. Now, this is only 3. These are only 3 of the writing prompts sometimes that we use. There's lists of them, which you'll have in your resource guide. But really, it increased sleep, mood, relationships. Lisa Baumley, who is a cognitive behavior therapist in Moscow, Idaho, near where I am, uses a lot of these strategies. And she and I have collaborated a lot on helping kids understand their own behaviors, but then how to increase those behaviors to be positive. And so the gratitude generator is in your resource guide as well. I really encourage you to take a look at it, because I have found that this makes great differences in kids. And for kids who can't write really well, a gratitude generator doesn't have to be in writing. It can be verbal. And then that increases the human connection as well as decreasing the anxiety and builds trust with an adult. And then an anxiety breakdown. This is a good one for little kids who can't really express their feelings, and caregivers they don't really know what to ask, but this really helps them ask the right questions. When I'm worried, where's the worry coming? Where's this worry coming from? And am I having negative thoughts? What do I do that I have control that I can keep from happening? Helping kids process through that. If I have a really little kid in front of me, I'll teach the caregivers, ask them what part of their body feels angry first. And then they have to identify, and that really starts the conversation with kids. But caregivers can do this, but sometimes they don't know what to do. So sometimes you'll have to help them build that plan. So this also, the anxiety breakdown, is in your resource guide. Some of you have probably seen this before, but I felt it was really helpful, particularly for school-age kids. So Lisa, if you could pop to the next 2. I know we're going through these pretty quickly, but they're all in your resource guide if you want more information about them. Some apps, we do live in an online world, and I had somebody ask me one time, so you're teaching online safety online? And the connection didn't come to them. They thought that everything should be done with pencil paper. But the reality of it is our kids live in an online world. When Dr. Lisa was talking about the research that the discipline referrals cut in half, that's because the online world is like a third arm for our kids. They are used to a world that has digital sources. They've never lived without it. And so if you say we're going to learn about online practices and safety, but you never use online, to them, they don't understand. There's no connection there. So there's some great online tools. These are from from Lisa Baumley in Moscow, Idaho, who uses these regularly in her cognitive behavior therapy. Now, some of these are not free, but some of them are free. So this is also in your resource guide. So I just encourage you to check them out and see if there's anything you want to look at or try. And so all of these are going to be also posted on the CTAC website. And I know that Diana's going to tell you a little bit more about that in a little bit. Lisa, if you'll pop the slide. And then right now, we really want to make sure we're answering your questions. So if you have some questions, can you put them in the chat for us so that we can try to get to those for you and answer questions for you?
Yes, great.
I'll
Thank
give.
you so much, everyone. Dana, thank you so much. Lisa, thank you so much. We did have a couple of questions that did come in terms of the resource guide that you have been referring to, Dana. We
Yes.
have a couple of folks who have said, yeah, how can I access it and whatnot? So you will be seeing you'll be getting them also, though, as mentioned in the slides, they'll be posted on our CTAC training webpage within the next 2 to 3 days. But I also believe there is a link for the PDF that might be coming up shortly on the chat box. So be on the lookout for that. But again, all the resources, so the recording, the slides in a PDF form, and the resource guide mentioned will be again posted on our website, ctechny.org, within the next 2 to 3 business days. So I do want to say thank you to our presenters. Really informative. There's been a lot of feedback and comments from folks in the chat box saying this is really helpful. So let's get into some of the questions. We do have a good amount of time for Q&A. So again, please, any questions, feel free to put them into the chat box. So the first question that came in is, how did the authors know the average age of encountering porn as being the age of 9 years old? So I believe you had mentioned this a little bit earlier on, Lisa. I don't know if you know any of the specifics of how they collected data. Were there surveys? How did they go about getting that average age?
There's obviously lots of different parameters of like, and it depends on the resource that you go to. What I look at is from mostly the CDC, some the Pew Research. I rely on. There's definitely also university research that's in there, and then I put alerts actually on my account, Google Alerts. So anytime research gets published in any of these areas, I get sent these research papers that are being published, and obviously not all of them are equal, and so you kind of have to look at who's sponsoring them and what that is. But generally, the ages has gone down so much younger, mostly because of the ad bundling that occurs, that's targeting kids, so that they can get consumers earlier on.
Great, thank you. We had another question come in around, as you were both talking about, what are some tips that providers can share with caregivers who might be concerned about the technology use or technology overuse with kids and youth, children. At what age do you loosen up supervision with phones? And also, just to add to that, any considerations to keep in mind. So I know one of the chapters talked about, any like special unique needs for folks. So wondering if you could maybe delve a little bit into that. Is there an average age? When should you loosen up those supervision with youth? And again, any considerations to keep in mind that might help to impact that decision?
So from what my experiences and the work that I've done, if you can get kids all the way through middle school without a device or without having social media, you're winning. Because that's the majority of issues happen between 6th and 8th grade. Like that is the dumpster fire years. Hormones are changing, access to devices and social media truly is when I see the most mental health crisis, like exposure happening at those ages. So if you can get past that or make that recommendation to parents, for sure, use those technology use continuum assessments to like give out to parents and families that you're working with, because that can give them kind of eyes on of like the areas that are happening with their own families and their kids, that are happening there. Typically, what I see responsible use start to happen is between sophomore and junior year. So freshman year is still a bit dicey. Kids still haven't kind of come on board, but I would say for girls specifically between sophomore and junior year in that summer is you think they start to like get it, that it doesn't need to rule their life anymore. And boys tend to be a little bit behind just developmentally, and they tend to be the recipients of a lot of kind of aggressive, kind of sexualized content exposure for girls who are trying to get their attention and things like that. So it's a little bit harder with boys, and that training has to come in much earlier so that they don't fall prey to that, and those behaviors.
Great, thank you. Dan, I don't know if you wanted to add anything.
Well, Dr. Lisa is such a great expert. In the schools, we noticed that we're getting kids with phones from the time they're in, pre-K. I'm surprised. It's going down all the time. But I think teaching kids and really it's about teaching parents too. It really has to be wraparound, right? Um, that little kids with phones is just a bad idea, and that's my opinion. Although I think the research would back me up because of brain development. And so in the schools, phones become a real problem. I think we're finally getting the idea as a culture that we need to look at phone use and how that impacts our kids. And so I think that parents are becoming more and more open to listening to what some of the risks are, and but not just risks, we got to have solutions. Okay, so we all know it's a problem, what do we do about it? I think that's the big thing. Even in the chat box, I noticed that somebody said that they wish there was a literacy course, a digital literacy course for middle and high school. And I'm happy to say that there is. The Digital Citizen Academy is creating one now where it not only has the digital citizen rules that they teach depending on what age your kid is, but Dr. Lisa has created a diversion program because we know that kids, if they get a device, sometimes they're going to make a mistake. So does that mean they, go down the road of, the worst possible consequences? No, we have to teach them so that they know what's appropriate and what isn't. And so I really like that, that justified response of using diversion programs rather than just hammering a kid really hard because they did something they didn't realize they shouldn't have done because other kids were doing it or something. And then giving kids alternatives. If they think the phone and the games online or the social media online is the only thing that they have as a recourse, then they won't think of anything else. So we've got to guide them through alternatives that they can do that are a whole lot of fun. So, I don't know if that answers questions. I know somebody was concerned about a kid in trauma and ACEs and using the social media as kind of an escape. And I have seen that. It's really trying to give them alternatives to the social media because sometimes turning off the social media can really help them work through some of their issues. But if they're always on it, then it kind of makes them stuck sometimes. But of course, that's case by case. But I just really think we need to give kids alternative activities to do while also teaching them good digital literacy.
Yeah, no, I appreciate both of you. I think what you mentioned earlier on, right, is finding that balance. Like social media, technology is not going anywhere. This is the world that we live in. And for these younger generations too, they are coming about where they don't know what it's like to not have access to
Right.
technology, right? So, I see that particularly with my niece and nephew too, where everything is just so very quick and easy to access because you can ask Alexa, or you can just, even if you don't know how to type, you can do, a voice, have it just sort of show up on your parents, or caregiver's phone, and you have immediate access. So they don't really know what it's like to grow up, right? Or to do dial up or to not even have access to internet. So I appreciate you, really honing in on the fact that we have to find that balance, not just for youth, but how caregivers themselves can also support youth and, at times for caregivers themselves. Backing on, something that you had just mentioned, Dana, how do we get children, and this is one of the questions that came in, how do we get children and adolescents to buy into making some of these changes for a more balanced or healthy or safe digital use, particularly keeping in mind that as a caregiver or a provider, you're working with one sort of household, but you have larger groups of peers, and your peers might have a little bit more freedom. So how do you get that buy-in for children where you have an adult or a caregiver or provider saying, hey, here's some information so that you can make an informed decision, but then they have their peers that don't really have some of those parameters. How do you get the buy-in for folks?
Well, and I think kids have to be able to have a say in that, right?
Mhm.
When we went into the schools, we would talk to groups of kids, but then we also talked to kids individually. And getting each kid to do their own use, set their own goals, and make it okay that it's not the same goal as everybody else. Because individuality is something that Gen Z would say they value greatly, but yet they don't practice very much because they really are conscious about what everybody else is doing. And so trying to get them to understand that their goals can be different, that growth mindset, right? Their goals can be different than everybody else. But I think what Lisa said, getting students to be self-aware, that awareness piece is absolutely 90% of the battle. They have to understand where they are and what is really beneficial for them. With older kids, you can start by setting goals. Okay, what is your goal in 5 years? What do you want to be in 5 years? Where do you want to be? Do you want to be in college? Do you want to be working at a restaurant? I mean, because it just depends on, do you want to be an electrician? What's your goals? Okay, so let's plan backwards. How do we get there? And if we say, how do we get there? It isn't from being on social media 15 hours a day. I'm exaggerating, of course. But if we have a goal and here's where we want to be, then let's back up and where do we need to start in order to get there? And letting kids create that is important. Now, when you get younger kids, they don't really see the future. It doesn't really matter much to them. So you use shorter goals. Okay, so by Christmas, where do we think we can be? And just start helping them make their own goals. But if they're really a kid that caves to peer pressure, get a few peers in with them and let them create a group plan. They can hold each other accountable. Really, the student voice is what makes all the difference. And there are exceptions to every rule, especially kids who are real sensory deficit. They're going to struggle to set their own goals. But getting peers to help them and caregivers to help them, it can be done. It's sometimes it's harder than others. Some kids can just, oh, okay, and do it. And some kids, it's just a bigger struggle. And so helping them through those things with their own voice, where they get to have a say, they'll buy into it a lot better.
Thank
I
you.
hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, appreciate that.
Yeah, I can weigh in just for a second. I will tell you that we have the Technology Leadership Council program is for teens to be mentors to other teenagers. And as a simple example, I did a conference and was speaking in this group, and there was a 12-year-old in the audience, and I was just going over the data. I was going over the structural damage that happens to the brain. I was going over the neuroactivity of the brain that gets damaged. I was just going over some of the things that happen online and the statistics and all of those things. And she came up to me afterwards and was like, I just deleted all of my social media. She's like, I really want to be a better steward in this space and I want to lead my peers. So I truly encourage everyone to keep empowering and mentoring those kids to know that they don't have to follow suit and they can be leaders in the space. And not every kid is a leader, but you got to find those ones that are, and then give them the ability to shine in that space.
Yeah, appreciate that. And I think, what you both mentioned really ties back to those trauma-informed care principles that you covered earlier on, right? That trust and transparency for providing youth the information so that they can be empowered to make their own decisions with the information. And that peer support too, right? That we sometimes really focus on caregivers and finding peer support with other adults, but also with children, right? With youth, because we more often than not, they're going to pay attention more so to a peer than an adult or a caregiver, right? Who's making these rules and making things more potentially quote unquote difficult or whatnot. So I do appreciate that. Let me see. There's a couple of questions that came in. Maybe a little bit, if you can talk to the connection between, or if there's a connection between digital overuse and autism or any other, sort of maybe mental health related concerns or developmental concerns. I don't know if you have any information about that.
There's lots of literature on the fact that our spectrum disorder kids can actually benefit from having that ability to have a digital connection and utilize tools. So I worked with a family that had 4 autistic children in undergrad. And so I spent a lot of time in that community, Families for Early Autism Treatment, as well as UCLA's Dr. Lavas, and his program was trained through that. So it was interesting, the picture exchange card system that you use for the more severe autistic kids is all now online. There's a program called Gemini that works really well. So there's some incredibly great tools that can be used on that. At the flip side of that, a lot of times spectrum kids will fall into their devices and like not come out. Like it's much easier. It's a much easier space for them because they don't have to make eye contact, because that social piece is not required as much in that space. So again, it just goes back to understanding what the science says. And again, tech is a tool, not as a toy. And if you can put them into parameters where they're protected and like there's a band around when they use it, then it can be very, very helpful in those situations.
Great, thank you. Um, do you have any suggestions around best practices around a teen's privacy in the social media world versus a parent's access to their account?
Mm, good question.
That's a really good question. I think that kids figure out ways to find their own privacy in many ways. So this goes back to kind of my empowering kids. You know, you can create Finstas on Instagram and like fake accounts and all of the things, and you can kind of hide. You have a public account that your parents and grandparents can follow, but you have like your real account, which is what your friends all see, but all of that is their digital footprint. So one of the lessons that we really like hone in on throughout every grade that we do is, what is your digital footprint? What are you putting out there? What is discoverable from the outside world? And do you feel confident about that? Parents often say, you know, if you haven't seen, there's a movie called, um, I think it's called Men, Women, and Children. It was Jennifer Garner and Adam Sandler, and it really talked about this online world. And Jennifer Garner's character goes in and is like this micro obsessive mom of looking at every single thing that their kid did, and that kid ended up going like way more to the extreme because there was like rebellion there. So the movie was so actually realistic. I was like, I remember talking about it all the time. It got terrible reviews because I think people were so depressed by it. But it really does a really good example of like what that challenge is. And I think that if you get the teens to have that ability to understand peers, um, audience versus parent audience is not necessarily differentiated, then they will make better choices. But we have to definitely get the kids to understand that before they're making these kind of fake accounts and things like that.
Great, thank you. Dana, did you want to try add anything?
The only thing I can really say is that Goldilocks zone is the Goldilocks zone. You got to find the balance. Not too
Mm.
much, not too little, but what's right for me that's going to move me in a positive direction. And when you think of kids and clients, what's the best plan for them? And it's going to be different for everybody. So finding that Goldilocks zone is really important to leverage everything you can find online.
Yeah, appreciate that, right? There's no sort of one size fits all for this. Thank you. Another question came in, is the zones of regulation evidence-based? Someone was wondering this as it's important for their work in terms of their employer. I'm assuming just, in terms of using
Yes.
evidence.
If you look in the book, the resources are all in the back, and they do. I mean, it's a big book, and it has everything's online now, almost that you can get. You just get a login, but the workbook itself has 17 lessons that it uses, and it is evidence based. And some of the lessons, you use for a classroom, some of the lessons you'd used for just individual kids, but it's really easy to understand. So having caregivers use it with kids is really awesome, because not only do you go through the lessons, but then you create color boards and little places they can put a card in a pocket, just because then you have that constant conversation of how I'm feeling. And so it is evidence based. It's in the back. The resources are in the back of the book. I couldn't quote them to you right now. Zones of Regulation is available online, and it's also available on Amazon if you want a hard copy.
Great, thank you. So I know you offer a lot of resources. Just a quick question came up about a particular app. So I don't know if you're familiar with, but if you are, any thoughts on the Bark app?
Yeah,
Lisa.
so I spent a lot of time working with and looking at the different apps. I think an app is better than no apps. Bark tends to do a fairly robust job, but they don't pick up everything, and they tend to have better marketing than they do product. So There is some help in that. Aura is another one. AURA is another app that can be helpful. Family Time iOS is another one that works really well. I would say if whatever the parent or the caregiver feels the most comfortable with is the one that they should be using.
Yeah. Thank you. So, some comments came in around, giving a cell phone to a child, a young person, primarily around, and just being sure that they're okay when maybe they're not home and in the presence of a caregiver. A question came in about how do you feel about schools banning cell phone use? Is this an effective solution? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, there's a really great resource, and I can add it to the what we send out afterwards. The London School of Economics did a study, a very, very robust study in 2016 about in Europe, in the UK, and they showed that personal cell phone use is primarily the issue with academic achievement. And so what they did was they took over 300,000 students, I believe, and they actually looked at merely taking away personal devices, not technology in the classroom at all. And that the students that were C level students went up about, or D level students went up about 14%, meaning that they would go from a failing grade to a passing grade. C level students went up about 8%, B level students went up about 6%, and A level students went up about 4%. So the higher achieving kiddos are the ones that are actually less impacted by it. And those that are struggling or having more academic issues, maybe learning issues, they're the ones that are most impacted by having a personal device in the classroom and that distraction. So I actually support having no personal devices inside the classrooms. I'm also very sensitive to families that have, two-parent families that are divorced or separated, and that those families want to be able to get a hold of their kids. That's a lot of times why we have kids at such young ages getting access to devices. So we've got to figure out a way to reconcile that. And I think that if we just are taking it out of the classroom itself, I don't think that that's going to impact or harm that family unity or connection that they need.
Yeah, and I think school districts are finding a variety of methods to accomplish that. Whether they have cell phone holders before you walk in the door and you have to drop your phone in, whether they require you to keep it outside the classroom or ban it altogether. I think districts are jumping on board too and understanding that we've got to figure out a way to still make sure kids have devices for learning, but not necessarily those personal devices.
Yep. Great. Thank you. Appreciate all of that. I am mindful of the time. Again, I want to say thank you to you all for joining us. Up on the screen right now, you are seeing some upcoming CTEC events that we are hosting. So hope you can join us for those. On the very next slide, again, a very big thank you to our presenters, Dana Chandler and Dr. Lisa Stroman, for such an informative offering. Again, the slides, the resource guide, and the recording will be available and up on our website in the next 2 to 3 days. I do also want to leave time for a survey. The link should be popping up, but it should also be coming up and maybe opening up on your screen. If you could take the time to fill out this very short survey, again, it does help to inform us in terms of any future offerings you might want related to technology use or overuse, and any other topics that are important to you and what you're seeing on the ground. So again, if you could please take the time to fill out this survey, we would really appreciate it. I'm seeing a lot of thank yous coming in, wonderful trainings. It was amazing. Thank you. Thank you. So I just do echo that from everyone on the chat here. Thank you, Dr. Stroman. Thank you, Dana Chandler. And again, on behalf of CTAC, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your day, everyone.